rousing round of Matt Reads Books. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to get notifications. And also, as I've been advised, smash that like button so that Matt Reads Books reaches into the heights of YouTube star power. We are still doing Theory of Justice with John Rawls, as we probably will be for at least another month. So we're going to just start off at Section 12, Interpretations of the Second Principle. And let me get out my pencil, and we will begin. Showing off my very cool Muji pencils. Okay. Let me start our timer, 30 minutes, as is our custom at this point. "30 minutes, 8 seconds, 7, 6, 5. Okay. Interpretations of the second principle. I have already mentioned that since the phrases everyone's advantage and equally open to all are ambiguous, both parts of the second principle have two natural senses. Because these senses are independent of one another, the principle has four possible meanings. Duh. Assuming that the first principle of equal liberty has the same sense throughout, we then have four interpretations of the two principles. These are indicated in the table below. And then there's a table that shows everyone's advantage, equally open, principle of efficiency, difference principle, and then where equally open is defined alternately as equality as careers open to talents and equality as equality of fair opportunity. The principle of efficiency is then defined as system of natural liberty versus liberal equality, and the difference principle is understood as natural aristocracy or democratic equality. You'll never guess what we're going to end up with. I shall sketch, in turn, these three interpretations: the system of natural liberty, liberal equality, and democratic equality. In some respects, this sequence is the more intuitive one, but the sequence via the interpretation of natural aristocracy is not without interest, and I shall comment on it briefly. In working out justice's fairness, we must decide which interpretation is to be preferred. I shall adopt that of democratic equality, explaining in the next section what this notion means. The argument for its acceptance in the original position does not begin until the next chapter. The first interpretation in either sequence I shall refer to as the system of natural liberty. In this rendering, the first part of the second principle is understood as the principle of efficiently adjusted so as to apply... wait a second. In this rendering, the first part of the second principle is understood as the principle of efficiency adjusted so as to apply to institutions, or in this case, to the basic structure of society. And the second part is understood as an open social system in which, to use the traditional phrase, careers are open to talents. I assume in all interpretations that the first principle of equal liberty is satisfied and that the economy is roughly a free market system, although the means of production may or may not be privately owned. The system of natural liberty asserts then that a basic structure satisfying the principle of efficiency and in which positions are open to those able and willing to strive for them will lead to a just distribution. Assigning rights and duties in this way is thought to give a scheme which allocates wealth and income, authority and responsibility in a fair way, whatever this allocation turns out to be. The doctrine includes an important element of pure procedural justice, which is carried over to the other interpretations. At this point, it is necessary to make a brief digression to explain the principle of efficiency. This principle is simply that of Pareto optimality, as economists refer to it, formulated so as to apply to the basic structure. Then there's a footnote to expositions of the principle of Pareto optimality in price theory and social choice, such as Koopman's 3 essays on the state of economic science and Amartya Sen's collective choice and social welfare, which probably is a pretty important source. And of course, the principle of efficiency is introduced by Pareto in his Manuel de Économie Politique, in Chapter 6, and there are also relevant translations in Page's Utility Theory, a book of readings. And the concept of indifference curves goes back to Edgeworth from mathematical physics. I shall always use the term efficiency instead, because this is literally correct, and the term optimality suggests that the concept is much broader than it is in fact. To be sure, the principle was not originally intended to apply to institutions, but to particular configurations of the economic system, for example, to distributions of goods among consumers or to modes of production. The principle holds that a configuration is efficient whenever it is impossible to change it so as to make some persons, at least one, better off without at the same time making other persons, at least one, worse off. Thus, a distribution of a stock of commodities among certain individuals is efficient if there exists no redistribution of these goods that improves the circumstances of at least one of these individuals without another being disadvantaged. The organization of production is efficient if there is no way to alter inputs so as to produce more of some commodity without producing less of another. For if we could produce more of one good without having to give up some of another, the larger stock of goods could be used to better the circumstances of some persons without making that of others any worse. These applications of the principle show that it is indeed a principle of efficiency. A distribution of goods or a scheme of production is inefficient when there are ways of doing still better for some individuals without doing any worse for others. I shall assume that the parties in the original position accept this principle to judge the efficiency of economic and social arrangements. See the accompanying discussion of the principle of efficiency. The principle of efficiency. And this is that section. Assume that there is a fixed stock of commodities to be distributed between two persons. Now, this is going to just be a dry economic exposition, so if you understand the principle of efficiency, you might be able to skip ahead, or at least turn it to 2 times speed to hear me speak even more quickly. Assume that there is a fixed stock of commodities to be distributed between two persons, x sub 1 and x sub 2. Let the line AB represent the points, such that, given x1's gain at the corresponding level, there is no way to distribute the commodities so as to make x2 better off than the point indicated by the curve. Consider the point D equals AB. So this is some point on this indifference curve. Then, holding x1 at the level A, the best that can be done for x2 is the level B. In figure 3, which is in the book, the point O, the 0, is the origin, represents the position before any commodities are distributed. The points on the line AB are the efficient points. Each point on AB can be seen to satisfy Pareto's criterion. There's no redistribution that makes either person better off without making the other worse off. This is conveyed by the fact that the line AB slopes downward to the right. Since there is but a fixed stock of items, it is supposed that as one person gains, the other loses. Of course, this assumption is dropped in the case of the basic structure, which is a system of cooperation producing a sum of positive advantages. Normally, the region OAB is taken to be a convex set. This means that given any pair of points in the set, the points on the straight line joining these 2 points are also in the set. Circles, ellipses, squares, triangles, and so on are convex sets. It is clear that there are many efficient points, in fact, all the points on the line AB. The principle of efficiency does not by itself select one particular distribution of commodities as the efficient one. To select among the efficient distributions some other principle, a principle of justice, say, is necessary. So I think that that's the sort of important normative point he has. Of 2 points, if one is northeast of the other, this point is superior by the principle of efficiency. Points to the northwest or southeast cannot be compared. The ordering defined by the principle of efficiency is but a partial one. Thus in figure 4, and this is the same diagram but with a certain 2 separate shadings, in figure 4, while C is superior to E, C being a point higher up on the curve and E being a point inside the curve, closer to the origin, D is superior to F, the same situation, but the point is closer to the midpoint of the curve. Both points are closer to the midpoint of the curve in the 45-degree angle from the origin. None of the points on the line AB are either superior or inferior to one another. The class of efficient points cannot be ranked. Even the extreme points A and B, at which one of the parties has everything, are efficient, according to the Pareto definition Rawls is giving, just as other points on AB. Observe that we cannot say that any point on the line AB is superior to all points in the interior of OAB. Each point on AB is superior only to those points in the interior southwest of it. Thus, the point D is superior to all points inside the rectangle indicated by the dotted line joining D to the points A and B. The point D is not superior to the point E. These points cannot be ordered. The point C, however, is superior to E, and so are all the points on the line AB belonging to the small shaded triangular region that has the point E as a corner. On the other hand, if one takes the 45-degree line as indicating the locus of equal distribution, this assumes an interpersonal cardinal interpretation of the axes, something not supposed in the preceding remarks. So basically, if you don't accept cardinal utility, everything that Rawls said up until this point still is true. You're only taking an ordinal interpretation of utility, but if you have a cardinal interpretation, then the next follows. If one counts this as an additional basis of decision, then all things considered, the point D may be preferable to both C and E. It is much closer to this line. One can even decide that an interior point, such as F, is to be preferred to C, which is an efficient point. Actually, in justice's fairness, the principles of justice are prior to considerations of efficiency, and therefore, roughly speaking, the interior points that represent just distributions will generally be preferred to efficient points, which represent unjust distributions. Of course, figure 4 depicts a very simple situation and cannot be applied to the basic structure. So his point is, if the 45-degree line, which is equality, is a principle of justice, and that justice is prior to economic efficiency, then we might prefer points that are closer to that 45-degree line, even against points that are on this efficiency curve that are further away from the 45-degree line. Now, the principle of efficiency can be applied to the basic structure by reference to the expectations of representative men. And he cites Buchanan's The Relevance of Pareto Optimality and Tulloch's The Calculus of Consent. And he follows one of the points in Two Concepts of Rules from the Philosophical Review. Yes, I don't really entirely understand that footnote. Thus we can say that an arrangement of rights and duties in the basic structure is efficient if and only if it is impossible to change the rules, to redefine the scheme of rights and duties so as to raise the expectations of any representative man, at least one, without at the same time lowering the expectations of some, at least one, other representative man. Of course, these alterations must be consistent with the other principles. That is, in changing the basic structure, we are not permitted to violate the principle of equal liberty, or the requirement of open positions. What can be altered is the distribution of income and wealth, and the way in which those in positions of authority and responsibility can regulate cooperative activities. Consistent with the constraints of liberty and accessibility, the allocation of these primary goods may be adjusted to modify the expectations of representative individuals. An arrangement of the basic structure is efficient when there is no way to change this distribution so as to raise the prospects of some without lowering the prospects of others. There are, I shall assume, many efficient arrangements of the basic structure. Each of these specifies a division of advantages from social cooperation. The problem is to choose between them, to find a conception of justice that singles out one of these efficient distributions as also just. If we succeed in this, we shall have gone beyond mere efficiency, yet in a way compatible with it. Now, it is natural to try out the idea that as long as the social system is efficient, there is no reason to be concerned with distribution. All efficient arrangements are, in this case, declared equally just. Of course, this suggestion would be outlandish for the allocation of particular goods to known individuals. No one would suppose that it is a matter of indifference from the standpoint of justice whether any one of a number of men happens to have everything. But the suggestion seems equally unreasonable for the basic structure. Thus it may be that under certain conditions serfdom cannot be significantly reformed without lowering the expectations of some other representative men, say that of landowners, in which case serfdom is efficient. Yet it may also happen under the same conditions that a system of free labor cannot be changed without lowering the expectations of some other representative man, say that of free laborers, so this arrangement is likewise efficient. More generally, whenever a society is relevantly divided into a number of classes, it is possible, let us suppose, to maximize with respect to any one of its representative men. These maxima give at least this many efficient positions, for none of them can be departed from to raise the expectations of others without lowering those of the representative man with respect to whom the maximum is defined. That's an interesting insight. Thus, each of these extremes is efficient, so-called, but they surely cannot all be just. They cannot be all just. Now, these reflections show only what we knew all along, that is, that the principle of efficiency cannot serve alone as a conception of justice. And then there's a footnote. It's recognized among welfare economists when they say that efficiency is to be balanced against equality, such as in Welfare and Competition by Shitovsky, and in Little's A Critique of Welfare Economics, and in Sen's remark on the limits of the principle of efficiency in collective choice and social welfare. Now, these reflections show only, etc., etc., therefore it must be supplemented in some way. Now, in the system of natural liberty, the principle of efficiency is constrained by certain background institutions. When these constraints are satisfied, any resulting efficient distribution is accepted as just. The system of natural liberty selects an efficient distribution roughly as follows. Let us suppose that we know from economic theory that under the standard assumptions defining a competitive market economy, income and wealth will be distributed in an efficient way. Now, the particular efficient distribution which results in any period of time is determined by the initial distribution of assets, that is, by the initial distribution of income and wealth, and of natural talents and abilities. With each initial distribution, a definite efficient outcome is arrived at. Thus it turns out that if we are to accept the outcome as just, and not merely as efficient, we must accept the basis upon which, over time, the initial distribution of assets is determined. In the system of natural liberty, the initial distribution is regulated by the arrangements implicit in the conception of careers open to talents, as earlier defined. These arrangements presuppose a background of equal liberty, as specified by the first principle, and a free market economy. They require a formal equality of opportunity, in that all have at least the same legal rights of access to all advantaged social positions. But since there is no effort to preserve an equality or similarity of social conditions, except insofar as this is necessary to preserve the requisite background institutions, the initial distribution of assets for any period of time is strongly influenced by natural and social contingencies. The existing distribution of income and wealth, say, is the cumulative effect of prior distributions of natural assets, that is, natural talents and abilities, as these have been developed or left unrealized, and their use favored or disfavored over time by social circumstances and such chance contingencies as accident and good fortune. Intuitively, the most obvious injustice of the system of natural liberty is that it permits distributive shares to be improperly influenced by these factors, so arbitrary from a moral point of view. So this is the lucky egalitarian streak is beginning. The liberal interpretation, as I shall refer to it, tries to correct for this by adding to the requirement of careers open to talents the further condition of the principle of fair equality of opportunity. The thought here is that positions are to be not only open in the formal sense, in a formal sense, but that all should have a fair chance to attain them. Offhand, it is not clear what is meant, but we might say that those with similar abilities and skills should have similar life chances. More specifically, assuming that there is a distribution of natural assets, those who are at the same level of talent and ability and have the same willingness to use them should have the same prospects of success regardless of their initial place in the social system. In all sectors of society, there should be roughly equal prospects of culture and achievement for everyone similarly motivated and endowed. The expectations of those with the same abilities and aspirations should not be affected by their social class. And the definition follows Sidgwick's suggestion in the Method of Ethics, and also Tawney's Equality, Williams's The Idea of Equality in Philosophy, Politics, and Society. The liberal interpretation of the two principles seeks, then, to mitigate the influence of social contingencies in natural fortune, on distributive shares. To accomplish this end, it is necessary to impose further basic structural conditions on the social system. Free market arrangements must be set within a framework of political and legal institutions, which regulates the overall trends of economic events and preserves the social conditions necessary for fair equality of opportunity. The elements of this framework are familiar enough, though it may be worthwhile to recall the importance of preventing excessive accumulations of property and wealth, and of maintaining equal opportunities of education for all. Chances to acquire cultural knowledge and skills should not depend upon one's class position, and so the school system, whether public or private, should be designed to even out class barriers. While the liberal conception seems clearly preferable to the system of natural liberty, intuitively it still appears defective. For one thing, even if it works to perfection in eliminating the influence of social contingencies, it still permits the distribution of wealth and income to be determined by the natural distribution of abilities and talents. Within the limits allowed by the background arrangements, distributive shares are decided by the outcome of the natural lottery, and this outcome is arbitrary from a moral perspective. There is no more reason to permit the distribution of income and wealth to be settled by the distribution of natural assets than by historical and social fortune. Furthermore, the principle of fair opportunity can be only imperfectly carried out, at least as long as some form of the family exists. The extent to which natural capacities develop and reach fruition is affected by all kinds of social conditions and class attitudes. Even the willingness to make an effort, to try, and so to be deserving in the ordinary sense, is itself dependent upon happy family and social circumstances. It is impossible in practice to secure equal chances of achievement in culture for those similarly endowed, and therefore we may want to adopt a principle which recognizes this fact and also mitigates the arbitrary effects of the natural lottery itself. That the liberal conception fails to do this encourages one to look for another interpretation of the two principles of justice. Before turning to the conception of democratic equality, we should note that of natural aristocracy. On this view, no attempt is made to regulate social contingencies beyond what is required by formal equality of opportunity, but the advantages of persons with greater natural endowments are to be limited to those that further the good of the poorer sectors of society. The aristocratic ideal is applied to a system that is open, at least from a legal point of view, and the better situation of those favored by it is regarded as just only when less would be had by those below, if less were given to those above. In this way, the idea of noblesse oblige is carried over to the conception of natural aristocracy. There's a citation to Santayana's account of aristocracy in Chapter 4 of Reason and Society, where he says, an aristocratic regimen can only be justified by radiating benefit and by proving that were less given to those above, less would be attained by those beneath them. And Rawls says he's indebted to Robert Rhodes for pointing out to him that natural aristocracy is a possible interpretation of the two principles of justice, and that an ideal feudal system might also try to fulfill the difference principle. Now, both the liberal conception and that of natural aristocracy are unstable. For once we are troubled by the influence of either social contingencies or natural chance on the determination of distributive shares, we are bound on reflection to be bothered by the influence of the other. From a moral standpoint, the two seem equally arbitrary. So, however we move away from the system of natural liberty, we cannot be satisfied short of the democratic conception. This conception I have yet to explain. And moreover, none of the preceding remarks are an argument for this conception, since in a contract theory, all arguments, strictly speaking, are to be made in terms of what it would be rational to agree to in the original position. But I am concerned here to prepare the way for the favored interpretation of the two principles, so that these criteria, especially the second one, will not strike the reader as extreme. Once we try to find a rendering of them which treats everyone equally as a moral person, and which does not weigh men's share in the benefits and burdens of social cooperation according to their social fortune or their luck in the natural lottery, the democratic interpretation is the best choice among the four alternatives. With these comments as a preface, I now turn to this conception. Section 13. Democratic equality and the difference principle. The democratic interpretation, as the table suggests, is arrived at by combining the principle of fair equality of opportunity with the difference principle. This principle removes the indeterminateness of the principle of efficiency by singling out a particular position from which the social and economic inequalities of the basic structure are to be judged. Assuming the framework of institutions required by equal liberty and fair equality of opportunity, the higher expectations of those better situated are just if and only if they work as part of a scheme which improves the expectations of the least advantaged members of society. The intuitive idea is that the social order is not to establish and secure the more attractive prospects of those better off, unless doing so is to the advantage of those less fortunate. See the discussion of the difference principle that follows. And what immediately follows is the discussion of the difference principle. The difference principle. Assume that indifference curves now represent distributions that are judged equally just. Then, the difference principle is a strongly egalitarian conception in the sense that unless there is a distribution that makes both persons better off, limiting ourselves to a two-person case for simplicity, an equal distribution is to be preferred. The indifference curves take the form depicted in Figure 5, which is a series of, I guess it would be more like this, a series of right angles going up at the 45 degree. These curves are actually made up of vertical and horizontal lines that intersect at right angles at the 45 degree line, again supposing an interpersonal and cardinal interpretation of the axes. No matter how much either person's situation is improved, there is no gain from the standpoint of the difference principle unless the other gains also. Suppose that x1, that is the x-axis for the first individual, is the most favored representative man in the basic structure. As his expectations are increased, so are the prospects of x2, the least advantaged man. In Figure 6, let the curve OP represent the contribution of x2's expectations made by the greater expectations of x1. The point origin, O, represents the hypothetical state in which all social primary goods are distributed equally. Now the OP curve is always below the 45 degree line, since x1 is always better off. Thus the only relevant parts of the indifference curves are those below this line, and for this reason the upper left-hand part of figure 6 is not drawn in. Clearly, the difference principle is perfectly satisfied only when the OP curve is just tangent to the highest indifference curves that it touches. In figure 6, this is at the point A. Note that the contribution curve, the curve OP, rises upward to the right because it is assumed that the social cooperation defined by the basic structure is mutually advantageous. It is no longer a matter of shuffling about a fixed stock of goods. Also, nothing is lost if an accurate interpersonal comparison of benefits is impossible. It suffices that the least favored person can be identified and his rational preference determined. A view less egalitarian than the difference principle, and perhaps more plausible at first sight, is one in which the indifference lines for just distributions, or for all things considered, are smooth lines convex to the origin, as in figure 7. So in this case, they're no longer strict. Oh, there's our timer. They're no longer strict right angles, but they are instead curves. The indifference curves for social welfare functions are often depicted in this fashion. This is the much more common way of graphing it. This shape of the curves expresses the fact that as either person gains relative to the other, further benefits to him become less valuable from a social point of view. A classical utilitarian, on the other hand, is indifferent as to how a constant sum of benefits is distributed. He appeals to equality only to break ties. If there are but two persons, then assuming an interpersonal cardinal interpretation of the axes, the utilitarian's indifference lines for distributions are straight lines perpendicular to the 45-degree line. Since, however, x1 and x2 are representative men, the gains to them have to be weighed by the number of persons they each represent. Since presumably x2 represents rather more persons than x1, the indifference lines become more horizontal, as seen in figure 8. The ratio of the number of advantaged to the number of disadvantaged defines the slope of these straight lines. Drawing the same contribution curve, OP, as before, we see that the best distribution from a utilitarian point of view is reached at the point which is beyond the point B, where the OP curve reaches its maximum. Since the difference principle selects the point B, and B is always to the left of A, utilitarianism allows, among other things equal, larger inequalities. To illustrate the difference principle, consider the distribution of income among social classes. Let us suppose that the various income groups correlate with representative individuals by reference to those expectations we can judge the distribution. Now, those starting out as members of the entrepreneurial class in property-owning democracy, say, have a better prospect than those who begin in the class of unskilled laborers. It seems likely that this will be true even when the social structures which now exist are removed. What then can possibly justify this kind of initial inequality in life prospects? According to the difference principle, it is justifiable only if the difference in expectation is to the advantage of the representative man who is worse off, in this case the representative unskilled worker. The inequality in expectation is permissible only if lowering it would make the working class even more worse off. Supposedly, given the rider in the second principle concerning open positions, and the principle of liberty generally, the greater expectations allowed to entrepreneurs encourages them to do things which raise the prospects of laboring class. Their better prospects act as incentives so that the economic process is more efficient, innovation proceeds at a faster pace, and so on. I shall not consider how far these things are true. The point is that something of this kind must be argued if these inequalities are to satisfy by the difference principle. I shall now make a few remarks about this principle. First of all, in applying it, one should distinguish between two cases. The first case is that in which the expectations of the least advantaged are indeed maximized, subject, of course, to the mentioned constraints, that is, the constraints of liberty. No changes in the expectations of those better off can improve the situation of those worst off. The best arrangement obtains what I shall call a perfectly just scheme. The second case is that in which the expectations of all those better off at least contribute to the welfare of the more unfortunate. That is, if their expectations were decreased, the prospects of the least advantaged would likewise fall. Yet the maximum is not yet achieved. Even higher expectations for the more advantaged would raise the expectations of those in the lowest position. Such a scheme is, I shall say, just throughout, but not the best just arrangement. A scheme is unjust when the higher expectations, one or more of them, are excessive. If these expectations were decreased, the situation of the least favored would be improved. How unjust an arrangement is depends on how excessive the higher expectations are, and to what extent they depend upon the violation of the other principles of justice, for example, fair equality of opportunity. But I shall not attempt to measure the degrees of injustice. The point to note here is that while the difference principle is, strictly speaking, a maximizing principle, there is a significant distinction between the cases that fall short of the best arrangement. A society should try to avoid situations where the marginal contributions of those better off are negative, since, other things equal, this seems a greater fault than falling short of the best scheme when these contributions are positive. The even larger difference between classes violates the principle of mutual advantage as well as democratic equality. See section 17. A further point is this. We saw that the system of natural liberty and the liberal conception go beyond the principle of efficiency by setting up certain background institutions and leaving the rest to pure procedural justice. Yes, I suppose.
I'm gonna get it done. It's getting there.
Good.
Well, I'm gonna go to sleep.
Sounds great.
Thanks for being a good friend when I suck.
No problem. You're doing great.
See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. The democratic conception holds that while pure procedural justice may be invoked, to some extent at least, the way previous interpretations do this still leaves too much to social and natural contingency. But it should be noted that the difference principle is compatible with the principle of efficiency. For when the former is fully satisfied, it is indeed impossible to make any one representative man better off without making another worse off, namely, the least advantaged representative man whose expectations we are to maximize. Thus, justice is defined so that it is consistent with efficiency, at least when the two principles are perfectly fulfilled. Of course, if the basic structure is unjust, these principles will authorize changes that may lower the expectations of some of those better off, and therefore the democratic conception is not consistent with the principle of efficiency if this principle is taken to mean that only changes which improve everyone's prospects are allowed. Justice is prior to efficiency and requires some changes that are not efficient in this sense. Consistency obtains only in the sense that a perfectly just scheme is also efficient. Next, we may consider a certain complication regarding the meaning of the difference principle. It has been taken for granted that if the principle is satisfied, everyone is benefited. One obvious sense in which this is so is that each man's position is improved with respect to the initial arrangement of equality. But it is clear that nothing depends upon being able to identify this initial arrangement. Indeed, how well off men are in this situation plays no essential role in applying the difference principle. We simply maximize the expectations of the least favored position subject to the required constraints. As long as doing this is an improvement for everyone, as so far I have assumed it is, the estimated gains from the situation of hypothetical equality are irrelevant, if not largely impossible to ascertain anyway. There may be, however, a further sense in which everyone is advantaged when the difference principle is satisfied, at least if we make certain assumptions. Let us suppose that inequalities and expectations are chain-connected. That is, if an advantage has the effect of raising the expectations of the lowest position, it raises the expectations of all positions in between. For example, if the greater expectations for entrepreneurs benefit the unskilled worker, they also benefit the semi-skilled. Notice that chain connection says nothing about the case where the least advantaged do not gain, so that it does not mean that all effects move together. Assume further that expectations are close-knit. That is, it is impossible to raise or lower the expectation of any representative man without raising or lowering the expectation of every other representative man, especially that of the least advantaged. There is no loose-jointedness, so to speak, in the way expectations hang together. Now, with these assumptions, there is a sense in which everyone benefits when the difference principle is satisfied. For the representative man who is better off in any two-way comparison gains by the advantages offered him, and the man who is worse off gains from the combinations which these inequalities make, from the contributions which these inequalities make. Of course, these conditions may not hold. But in this case, those who are better off should not have a veto over the benefits available for the least favored. We are still to maximize the expectations of those most disadvantaged. See the accompanying discussion of chain connection. Chain connection. For simplicity, assume that there are 3 representative men. Let x1 be the most favored and x3 the least favored, with x2 in between. Let the expectations of x1 be marked off along the horizontal axis, the expectations of x2 and x3 along the vertical axis. The curves showing the contribution of the most favored to the other groups begin at the origin as the hypothetical position of equality. Moreover, there is a maximum gain permitted to the most favored on the assumption that, even if the difference principle would allow it, there would be unjust effects on the political system and the like excluded by the priority of liberty. The difference principle selects the point where the curve for x3 reaches its maximum, for example, the point A in figure 9. Chain, and that A is sort of indistinct in my book, so I'm going to mark it in. Chain connection means that at any point where the x3 curve is rising to the right, the x2 curve is also rising, as in the intervals left of the points A and B in figures 9 and 10. Chain connection says nothing about the case where the x3 curve is falling to the right, as in the interval to the right of the point A in figure 9. The x2 curve may be either rising or falling. Chain connection does not hold to the right of B in figure 10. Intervals in which both the x2 and the x3 curves are rising define the intervals of positive contributions. Any more to the right increases the average expectation, average utility if utility is measured by expectations, and also satisfies the principle of efficiency as a criterion of change. That is, points to the right improve everyone's situation. In figure 9, the average expectations may be rising beyond the point A, although the expectations of the least favored are falling. This depends on the weights of the several groups. The difference principle excludes this and selects the point A. It's all about maximizing the least well-off. Close-knittedness means that there are no flat stretches on the curves for x2 and x3. At each point, curves are either rising or falling. All the curves illustrated are close-knit. I shall not examine how likely it is that chain connection and close-knittedness hold. The difference principle is not contingent on these relations being satisfied. However, when the contributions of the more favored positions spread generally throughout society and are not confined to particular sectors, it seems plausible that if the least advantaged benefit, so do others in between. Moreover, a wide diffusion of benefits is favored by 2 features of institutions both exemplified by the basic structure. First, they are set up to advance certain fundamental interests with which everyone has in common, and second, offices and positions are open. Thus, it seems probable that if the authority and powers of legislators and judges, say, improve the situation of the least favored, they improve that of citizens generally. Chain connection may often be true, provided the other principles of justice are fulfilled. If this is so, then we may observe that within the region of positive contributions, the region where the advantages of all those in favored positions raise the prospects of the least fortunate, any movement toward the perfectly just arrangement improves everyone's expectation. Under these circumstances, the difference principle has somewhat similar practical consequences as the principles of efficiency and average utility, if utility is measured by primary goods. Of course, if chain connection rarely holds, this similarity is unimportant, but it seems likely that within a just social scheme, a general diffusion of benefits often takes place. There is a further complication. Close-knittedness is assumed in order to simplify the statement of the difference principle. It is clearly conceivable, however likely or important in practice, that the least advantaged are not affected one way or the other by some changes in expectations of the best off, although these changes benefit others. In this sort of case, close-knittedness fails, and to cover the situation we can express a more general principle as follows. In a basic structure, with n relevant representatives, first maximize the welfare of the worst off representative man, second, for equal welfare of the worst off representative man, maximize the welfare of the second worst off representative man, and so on until the last case, which is for equal welfare of all the preceding n-1 representatives, maximize the welfare of the best off representative man. We may think of this as the lexical difference principle. That is the complete formulation of it. I think, however, that in actual cases this principle is unlikely to be relevant. For when the greater potential benefits of the more advantaged are significant, there will surely be some way to improve the situation of the less advantaged as well. The general laws governing the institutions of the basic structure ensure that cases requiring the lexical principle will not arise. Thus I shall always use the difference principle in the simpler form, and so the outcome of the last several sections is that the second principle reads as follows. Social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, to the greatest expected benefit of the least advantaged, and B, attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Finally, a comment about terminology. Economics may wish to refer to the difference principle as the maxi-min criterion, but I have carefully avoided this name for several reasons. The maxi-min criterion is generally understood as a rule for choice under great uncertainty, see section 26, whereas the difference principle is a principle of justice. It is undesirable to use the same name for two things that are so distinct. The difference principle is a very special criterion. It applies primarily to the basic structure of society via representative individuals whose expectations are to be estimated by an index of primary goods. See section 15. In addition, calling the difference principle the maxi-min criterion might wrongly suggest that the main argument for this principle from the original position derives from an assumption of very high risk aversion. There is indeed a relation between the difference principle and such an assumption, but extreme attitudes to risk are not postulated, see section 28. In any case, there are many considerations in favor of the difference principle in which the aversion to risk plays no role at all. Thus, it is best to use the term maxi-min criterion solely for the rule of choice under uncertainty. And that brings us to the end of Matt Reed's books. Tune in next time to learn about Section 14, Fair Equality of Opportunity and Pure Procedural Justice. Again, make sure to subscribe and click the like and bell icons and leave a comment if you enjoyed it, or if you didn't enjoy it. I guess I don't care. Have a great night.